Hi, we're here with Denny Zeitlin, the composer of the score for Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and he's going to tell us a little bit about the music, his first film score, and the evolution and the collaboration with Philip Kaufman, the director. Denny, what are your thoughts after 25 years?
Boy, it's really a nostalgic experience to think back to 1977 when Phil first approached me about this project. I'd always hoped that someday I'd get a chance to score a Hollywood film. But I figured it would probably be unlikely that it would ever happen because usually if you want to get into that kind of musical work, you have to live in L.A., you have to knock on doors for years, prostrate yourself in various forms to finally get a project. And then usually that first project is some tiny little film with a budget enough for a kazoo player and an accordion, and that's it. So I figured it was probably not in my musical horoscope to ever do one of these things. I was a jazz musician, I was recording, I was touring and loving that. But I thought this probably never would happen. So I was delighted and surprised when Phil Kaufman called me, I guess it was in the fall of 1977, to let me know that he was doing this work on Invasion of the Body Snatchers and wondered whether I would like to do the score. I was kind of blown away, and we got together and talked. I'd known Phil over the years casually. We really hadn't spent a lot of time together, but he grew up in Chicago. He knew of my music. He had heard some of my records in the past, and it turned out that he had it in his head that someday he'd like to do a movie and use me for a jazz score. And at this point on the drawing board for this movie, the main character, the Donald Sutherland role of Matthew, was going to be an avocational jazz saxophone player. So it kind of made sense that he was calling me about doing a jazz score. But after our initial discussion, in which I was very excited, as things began to shape up, the plot changed a bit, and Matthew morphed from a jazz avocational saxophone player into a deputy public health inspector. And now the whole scene began to change in Phil's mind. Now he didn't want a jazz score. He wanted a 20th century electronic acoustic score for which I had no established credentials at all.
Right.
So we talked about it, and Phil's always been a maverick and a very gutsy guy, and he's the sort of person who'd be willing to take a chance on somebody he believed in, even in the absence of credentials. So it wasn't too hard to convince Phil that I was capable of doing this symphonic score with electronics and everything, even though I really hadn't had a track record of it. I was confident I could do it, and we talked about it, and he believed in me. But now I had to convince his producer, Robert Solo. And I'm telling you, if I'd been in Solo's position, I don't know that I would have hired me. Here he was sitting on what he thought was going to be a big film. At that time, $5 million was not a huge budget, but it wasn't a shoestring budget in those times either. There was a lot riding on it. So why should he take a chance on a totally unknown when he did have the budget available to hire John Williams or whoever he wanted? And we met, and I was amazed that he actually allowed me to come on board. And so the thing began to gel at this point, and I realized, wow, I've got this contract. I'm going to do the thing, but how am I really going to go about doing it? So I began to amass a musical team. And fortunately, I knew somebody who'd had a considerable amount of Hollywood experience scoring, who also is a just penultimate jazz musician, Roger Kellaway. We'd known each other back in the University of Illinois days when we were both in our late teens and early 20s. So I called Roger, and he was incredibly gracious. I hadn't spoken with him in some years. He spent over an hour on the phone with me, telling me about the whole lay of the land in Hollywood, who I would need to consider, who are the components of the team that one has to get together to do a project like this. So, first of all, I needed a conductor, because I had no experience conducting, and there was no reasonable way that I would expect myself to get up on the podium in front of a symphony orchestra for the first time and conduct the whole score. Right. So fortunately, I had Roger Kellaway to do that for me. He's an excellent conductor.
So Roger conducted the whole
Roger
score?
conducted the score for me. Then I had to find an orchestrator. And that turned out to be not a terribly easy task, because a lot of orchestrators don't want to work with a first-time composer. They figure it's going to be a huge hassle, that they're going to have to hold my hand through the whole procedure, that I'll make all kinds of timing errors that they'll have to cover up for and redo. So a lot of them don't even want to mess with a first-time out person. But I found one of the most veteran orchestrators in the business and one of the most skilled who was absolutely up for it, a guy named Greg McRitchie.
Oh, yes, I know well.
Do you know Greg?
Yes.
Well, he was a beautiful guy.
Yeah.
And I sent him some of my recordings and told him what I was going to do, and he was really excited about it. And he was so healthy psychologically and so gifted musically that he didn't have a kind of ego that would have to step in and change my score or add notes, delete notes. He didn't change a note of music. All he did is what I wanted him to do, was to make decisions about what instruments would play those notes at various times. And that was a decision I was not capable of making. I'd had no training in orchestration formally. I knew what I was hearing in my head. I might know that I want brass here, but to know that 3 trumpets and 2 trombones and 1 tuba ought to be playing that? But Greg made those decisions and made them beautifully. And that was a wonderful collaboration. I was really sorry to hear that he passed away a few years back. But he was one of the grand old men of orchestration, and he did an impeccable job with this score. Then I needed some other people on the team. I needed a music editor. The music editor, as most of film buff listeners know, is the person that actually times out all the scenes when decisions are made where music is going to be. He or she gives you sheets that shows to the 100th of a second where all the action occurs within a different scene, so that when you're writing the music, you know exactly where you have to hit certain kinds of music in order to highlight the emotional stakes of that scene. And Ving Hershon was another old guard guy who worked with me and was very, very helpful. I had a coordinator of the music, a music production coordinator named Phil Sawyer, who I had done a number of projects with over the years, who understood sound effects extremely well. So it turned out he was a valuable liaison from the sound effects people in the movie to me as the music writer. Because one of the interesting challenges this film had was in Phil's idea that at times music needed to morph into sound effects, needed to morph back into music. So the dividing line was not clear, often, between who was doing what. And I think that really added to the reality and the gripping nature of this film. He also was very serious about not wanting the electronics to sound real electronic and machine-like. He wanted organic sounds because, after all, this was an invasion of an organic life form. So it was an interesting challenge to begin to shape the sounds. So those were the major people on the team initially. And then when it was time to record the symphonic part of this score, I was really fortunate to be able to take this music to the Burbank studio and use the old classic soundstage at the Burbank studio with Dan Wallen as the engineer. And that was the most exciting moment in this whole experience for me, was when this symphony orchestra really burst into flame with the music I'd been slaving over for 10 weeks. So that was really, really something for me. But